Good afternoon. My name is William Ginobili. I'm the Dean of the Harvard School of Dental Medicine, and we're so pleased to have so many of you joining us, both in person and via webinar, for our annual Professor Donald B. Giddon, DMD, PhD, annual lecture in behavioral medicine and dentistry as a part of Research Day. So this morning has been a very energizing event here at the School of Dental Medicine. After several years to be in person and have the wonderful array of posters throughout the school, and you could just see the collective energy outside in the REB area of our students presenting the research in so many different areas. And so I think all of us as faculty, staff, and other students here at the School of Dental Medicine, we were just so impressed with the quality of the presentations, just the presentation styles, and then the depth and breadth of research that's ongoing in our Harvard School of Dental Medicine community. So grateful to our faculty mentors, for our students, and those of us who are here this morning. And so I'd like to say that we have, over the last count that Dawn DaCosta gave me, was just over 160 people have registered for this event. We have over 80 posters and then 40 different faculty instructors who provided their time, not only here at the School of Dental Medicine, but from our affiliate Foresight, the associated hospitals, and so many in the community coming together. So I'm grateful to them. Special thanks, and we'll hear more about this, to Dawn DaCosta, Jake Jacobellis. Without them and their vision to bring this together, to have these electronic boards throughout the school, the promotion, the rallying together and getting people together for our judging, we're really grateful to you for making today possible. So now I'm going to hand things over to Dr. Yinsa Yang, our Associate Dean for Research, and she's going to introduce Ms. Jane Barrow, who is our Director of Global Health and also the Executive Director of the Initiative to Integrate Oral Health and Medicine at the school, to then present our distinguished speaker today, Dr. Lisa Jamieson. Dr. Yang.
Thank you, Will. I would like to echo that the Research Day each year is the most important day in our school, and it's really great to see all these students talking about their research with enthusiasm. So welcome to the Donald Giddon Lecture in Behavioral Science and Dentistry. This lecture series was established in 2007 and made possible by the Giddon Family Endowment. The lecture have occurred in the past and this year as well, in conjunction with HSDM's Research Day, and with the goal to broaden the behavior and social science perspectives of our faculty and students in oral health care. Each year, a committee selects a nationally or internationally renowned scientist in behavioral science or medicine as a speaker to join this big event at HSDM. And the lecture has highlighted a broad range of topics, including public health, dental education, pain, stress and disease, and facial perception, just to name a few. Most importantly, I would like to take this opportunity to recognize Dr. Giddon's vision and generosity in making this lecture series possible. Dr. Giddon is a dedicated alumnus and professor emeritus of HSDM, who in his long and celebrated career has given back to the school with impactful gifts devoted to scholarship and research. In addition to this lectureship, he has designated a seminar room for research, among other generous contributions to the school. Without further ado, I would like to give this podium to Dr. Jane Barrow, who's going to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Lisa. It's my distinct honor to introduce this year's Professor Don Giddon lecturer, Dr. Lisa Jamieson. Dr. Jamieson received her Bachelor of Dental Surgery, her Master of Community Dentistry with distinction, as well as her PhD from the University of Otago School of Dentistry in New Zealand. She currently holds a National Health and Medical Research Council Senior Research Fellowship and is a professor at the Australian Research Centre for Population Oral Health at the University of Adelaide. She has established and leads the University of Adelaide's Indigenous Oral Health Unit, which is one of the most internationally respected Indigenous health research units in the world. She has also established 4 research interventions among Indigenous populations in Australia and was involved in establishing the dental component of Wave 3 of the Aboriginal birth cohort. She is recognized as a leading researcher in Indigenous oral health, and in this role has been a contributor of information to national Indigenous oral health and dental services policy throughout Australia. She has published widely and been an invited presenter at numerous international research meetings involving Indigenous oral health. She's on the editorial board of BMC Public Health, Community Dentistry, and Oral Epidemiology, as well as the Australian Dental Journal, and has served on several recent National Health and Medical Research Council working parties to improve oral health. And I would also like to add that she is a longtime collaborator of our very own Pawazin Ilani. So I would like to just make one housekeeping note. We'd like to ask that all questions be held until the end of Dr. Jamieson's presentation. We'll have a Q&A session at that time. And so now I would like to introduce Dr. Lisa Jamieson, who will speak to us about Indigenous oral health inequities and the role of intersectionality. Dr. Jamieson.
Thank you so much, Jane, for the kind invitation and for the invitation to present this address. So I'm so sorry that I can't be there in person. I absolutely love Boston and was really looking forward to meeting many of you there in person. You know, it's so funny. I feel like I'm jet lagged and I haven't traveled anywhere. So before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which I speak, or the land on which the audience resides, is the territory of the Massachusetts and their neighbours in the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples. As with Australia and New Zealand, where I was born and raised, I acknowledge the repeated violations of sovereignty, territory, and water perpetrated by colonisers who have impacted the original inhabitants of the Boston area for over 500 years. I extend my respect to citizens of these nations who live here today, to elders past, present, and emerging, to their ancestors, and to all Indigenous peoples. Now, I do these acknowledgements no matter which country I am presenting to, but it's especially important in Australia when we acknowledge the Indigenous owners of Australia, who are the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples. And I would also like to share my own acknowledgement to Dr. Giddon, who has been an iconoclast really in our field. He's absolutely led the charge in terms of founding and leading the Behavioural Epidemiological Health Sciences Research Scientific Group of the IADR. He's established the IADR Giddon Award for Distinguished Research in the Behavioural Sciences, which is an award that recognises and highlights contributions to dentistry from a vast array of other disciplines, including social and cultural anthropology, education, psychology, psychiatry, sociology, and social work. I think that so much in epidemiology in which I'm trained, we tend to have a very narrow view of conceptualising and analysing what it is that shapes oral health. So I think that Dr. Giddon has really forced us to acknowledge that there are a much broader set of disciplines which really feed into our given profession. So the Giddon Award is one of the most sought after honours bestowed by IADR's BEHSR group, and I've had the great pleasure of reviewing many of the papers submitted for this prestigious prize. So just a bit of an outline of my presentation. I'm going to be giving my own positionality statement before moving on to provide a definition of intersectionality. I will describe what it means to be Indigenous in the Australian context, then go on to describe some empirical research that we have done around intersectionality and Indigenous oral health inequities. I will provide some concluding comments and some suggestions for moving forward. Along the way, I'm also going to talk about jacaranda trees, the fabulous novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, and Hokey Pokey ice cream. But before we start all that, I want to show you where Adelaide is relative to Boston. So Adelaide is right down here. It's the capital city of South Australia in Australia, and Boston, of course, is half a world away on the other side of the planet. We have different climates and different time zones. I was fascinated to just look at the climatic differences between the two cities. These temperatures are in Fahrenheit. I usually work in Celsius, but you can still see the the very stark differences. So especially for the winter months in Boston, we have almost, very freezing cold conditions compared to temperatures, 3 times that for the summer. And then when we look to, Boston's summer, June, July, August, we have, not too dissimilar temperatures for the winter that we have in South Australia. As I mentioned, I absolutely love Boston, but I'm just always amazed at how people can live in a place which is so cold. I had the fortune of being in Boston one year in March, and I thought I was going to die. I mean, I obviously wasn't wearing enough warm clothing, but yeah, scenes like this, which are obviously very beautiful, but they strike terror in me. So Adelaide is very warm. We have lovely seasonal changes when it's the fall. Our winters don't get much colder than this. And the jacaranda trees bloom in our spring. So jacaranda trees are everywhere in Adelaide, everywhere in South Australia. They're not native to Australia, they're from South America, but come October, November, the whole city is abloom with these purple flowers that sort of wash down on the city. It becomes a bit of a pest after a while, but it's a very beautiful sight to see. And then I just wanted to drill down a little bit more because I'm sure that many are perhaps not familiar with perhaps Australia, but probably South Australia as well. And then to compare this with Massachusetts and the US more generally. So Australia is geographically not too much smaller than the US, but we don't have very many people. So you can see from this map here, we have huge areas of the country which are basically uninhabited because it's desert and it's very hot. This is South Australia down the bottom here. Again, over 3/4 of it is sparse desert land. Adelaide is right down the bottom here. So if we compare the area, we've got just over 10,500 square miles in Massachusetts. We've got 380,000 square miles in South Australia. Massachusetts population is 6.9 million. We've got 1.7 million in South Australia. This is what gets me though. The population density of Massachusetts is 839 persons per square mile. We've got 0.07 people. So if you like your space and you're feeling a bit crowded, come on over and see us. Boston population is about 690,000 compared to Adelaide's population, which is roughly double that, so 1.4 million. So if I start with my positionality statement, so a positionality statement is essentially a critical reflection that positions me within the research that I do. This is a common practice in social science research, but less so in epidemiology. I think it's critically important in any form of intersectionality work, especially in partnership with Indigenous groups. I am a white, heterosexual, able-bodied woman, born and raised in a large family in rural New Zealand. I have benefited my entire life from the privileges broader society and political landscapes have extended to me. I think one of my first realizations that not all people experience privilege came through my relationship with my friend Tanya. This is a photo of my 7th birthday party. This is me. This is my friend Tanya. And this is my younger brother, who is a cheeky little monkey. Tanya was a Maori girl. In New Zealand, the Indigenous groups are called the Maori people. So Tanya was a Maori girl who with her brother had been adopted by a white family, which was a very common practice in the 1970s in New Zealand. We were best friends all through primary school, but at high school, her adoptive parents' relationship broke down and Tanya and her brother were effectively made wards of the state. She left school at the age of 15 and for the longest time bounced around being homeless, running with gangs and having babies. But at the time of this photo, when we were both age 7, if you were to have said that at the age of 50, one of us would be presenting to Harvard, we both would have thought that we had a pretty equal chance. So I left home and went to university and trained to be a dentist, then spent 4 years traveling as a volunteer dentist for various charity organizations. I spent a year and a half in Uganda during the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. 1 in 3 of my patients was HIV positive, and we had strict protocols for dealing with infection control and risk management. But at one point I was treating an HIV positive patient and a splodge of blood managed to get under my goggles and into my eye. Within 12 hours, I was on a flight back to London to get immediate treatment, which was not even close to what the patients I had been treating were entitled to. And I realized then just how much being white and working for a relatively wealthy organization entitled me to. And I've had the huge honor for the last 18 years to be working with colleagues and mentors at the University of Adelaide's Indigenous Oral Health Unit. This is a photo showing me with the chair of the Indigenous Advisory Committee and our first Indigenous PhD candidate last year. There have been many, many stories of the covert and overt racism experienced throughout the lives of most of our participants and Indigenous colleagues. We always give Indigenous participants the option of where they would like to do the data collection, with some choosing home, some choosing the local Aboriginal community-controlled health service, and others choosing a public place like a park or a library. One participant opted for a cafe, but upon going there with the research officer, was told they had to leave because the cafe didn't serve Aboriginal people. This is downtown Adelaide in 2015 and is completely illegal. The staff member was all guns blazing, reading the Riot Act to the cafe owner, but the Indigenous participant didn't want any fuss and just wanted to leave. This is just one example of the day-to-day racism many Indigenous Australians face. I have never experienced racial discrimination in any form. In fact, I have benefited from being white my entire life. So if we move on now to what intersectionality is. So it's a concept that's been around since the 1850s when Sojourner Truth was an African-American woman who spoke out against some of the oppressions that she was experiencing. Essentially, it's a Black feminist theoretical framework, but the term intersectionality was first coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. This is Dr. Crenshaw down here, in 1991 to name the experiences of Black women who face intersecting cumulative forms of oppression and discrimination, so essentially racism and sexism. So in the broad sense, intersectionality is the interconnectedness of the social categorizations that we have, as humans have created. There are many different forms of social categorizations, including race, race, class, gender, caste, ethnicity, on and on and on. But it's a definition which applies to a given individual or a group. These intersecting overlapping identities can be both empowering and oppression. So that at the heart of intersectionality is the premise that oppressions are interlinked and cannot be treated, solved, or should be even discussed in isolation. So there has been some very important work over the last decade or so done by Greta Bauer. This is the photo of Greta at the top here, and Ravinda Samri. I think, and this is where I appreciate Dr. Giddon's contributions, because we do need to consider many broad disciplines, including sociology, anthropology, political science, epidemiology, on and on and on. I think a really useful framework is to consider the wheel of power and privilege. So essentially what the wheel of power privilege is saying that those at the heart, those in the middle of the circle, really hold the reins of power, whereas those who are more marginalized around the outside don't tend to have a seat at the table. So essentially the more of these values that you, the more of these categories that a group may fit into, the more power they will likely have. So the World Health Organization's Commission on the Social Determinants of Health has done much to frame how society now sees health and how it's generated, and has listed many upstream determinants, including governance, macroeconomic policy, social policy, public policy, culture, and societal values. But some critics of Michael Marmot, who developed the social determinants of health with his team, have criticised the social determinants of health by saying that there has been an omission of the power imbalances, that really the leaders of the social determinants of health have all really been sitting in these categories, and the voices and the lived experiences of those on the outer have been theoretically included, but the voices have been missing. So the same power hierarchies are essentially replicated. And this, I think, is central to intersectionality, this wheel of power and privilege. So there's been a lot of intersectionality work that's been done in medicine. These are just a few screenshots I've taken of Lancet publications. So we've got intersectionality in developing evidence-based policy. This is one of the papers by Ravinda, adopting an intersectionality framework to address power and equity in medicine, intersectionality and why it matters to global health. But there's been less in the field of oral health. So here's just a few here. We've got papers that have come out from United Kingdom, some of the work that we've done here in Australia, and more again from Vanessa Muirhead, who's an established academic from Sheffield, I believe, in the United Kingdom. So if we move on now to me providing you a definition of what it is to be Indigenous in Australia, it's a group who identify themselves as being Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. The Torres Strait Islands are a group of islands that sit above Australia before you get to Papua New Guinea. Indigenous Australians comprise around 3% of the total Australian population, but there's over 300 different language groups. So this map shows the many distinct, varied, rich language groups that are alive and well today, amazingly, in Australia. I think it's important to consider that Indigenous Australians thrived in extreme conditions for over 65,000 years prior to colonisation in 1870. And ever since that time, so ever since colonisation, which was really just 250 years ago, Indigenous Australians have been subjected to genocide, to land theft, to disease, government policies of assimilation, disempowerment, racism, and disadvantage. So it's really no different to Indigenous populations in many other colonised countries. In modern day Australia, Indigenous Australians regrettably have higher rates of incarceration, suicide, unemployment, the list goes on really. This is a figure showing the Australian population distribution by Indigenous status. So the Indigenous profile is a lot younger, you can see, with a pretty much a half a triangle going up to the top there, whereas the non-Indigenous population sort of blooms out in the middle age area, but there's really not too much difference between infancy, childhood, young adulthood, and older adulthood. So I think the health inequities are present for every health outcome, but not excluding dental diseases, so dental caries, periodontal disease, oral cancers. I wanted to let you know just a little bit about the colonisation history in Australia. So remember that Indigenous Australians resided for 65,000 years, no problem. So the invasion, if you like, of Australia from the British began in 1788, and immediately there were clashes between Indigenous communities and British forces. There were many massacres. This is just one of the ones that have been documented in the literature. So this is in 1834. There was a Commonwealth Franchise Act developed in 1902. But so Australia as a country was only really officially formed in 1901. So not a year later, the Franchise Act excluded Indigenous people from the right to vote. There were a number of assimilation policies that were enacted throughout the years, but I think the largest or the most powerful one was in 1937, which was really when half, persons who identified as not 100% Indigenous, were essentially forced to conform to white society. I'll just mention the stolen generations here because that started in 1910 and only ended in 1970. So 60 years where Aboriginal children were forcibly removed from their families and placed with non-Indigenous families. The right to vote came in 1962. The Aboriginal flag was established in 1971. So this is 70 years after the country was formed. There's been a whole raft of Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. There's been a few of those actually. The Bringing Them Home report was the findings of the inquiry into the stolen generations. Finally, we have an acknowledgement of the stolen generations, but not until 1998. And in 2008, there was actually a formal apology from the then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd to Indigenous peoples, especially those of the stolen generation. And the background shot here is in 1976, and it was Gough Whitlam, who was the Prime Minister, and Vincent Ngari, who was an Indigenous man who led probably the country's first most successful land rights movement. And you probably can't see it there, but this is a symbolic gesture of Prime Minister Whitlam picking up some dirt from Vincent Ngari's land and putting the dirt back into the land of Vincent Ngari, because it was essentially giving the land back to the traditional owners. So as a consequence of these many acts of assimilation and policies, there's been destruction of traditional lands, there's been the emergence of health inequities, high incarcerations and poorer mental health. But there's also been incredible resilience, strength, courage and knowledge displayed from Indigenous Australians. And a little bit about racism as well. A lot of the field in racism as it pertains to health outcomes comes from Harvard's own Nancy Krieger. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dr. Krieger's work, but she's an absolute legend in the field. So she has described racism as being prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, community, institution, or society against persons on the basis of their membership of a particular racial ethnic group, typically one that is marginalised. And the other image I have there is of Dr. Yin Paradies. Yin Paradies is an Indigenous scholar based in Australia. I've had the privilege of working with him for many years now. And he goes further to say that racism is the belief that groups of humans possess different behavioural traits corresponding to inherited attributes, so it's biological, and that these can be divided based on superiority, that's a key word there, or one race over another. So racism is many things at the same time. It's interpersonal, intrapersonal, and structural. And I wanted to do a bit of a deeper dive into that because the racism iceberg is depicted here, shows the interpersonal and intrapersonal as the tip of the iceberg. And these are what you can sort of see at an everyday level, the hate crimes, the microaggressions, the everyday slights. But what the bulk of racism is the structural racism. It's what forces, it's what drives many of these interpersonal and intrapersonal racism to persist, because there's just so much of it. These are just a few examples, but there's media portrayals, there's again mass incarceration, there's differences in occupational, residential and school segregations, there's political representation, the whole gamut. And how does racism affect health, including oral health? So there's essentially three main ways. The first is through reduced access to the resources required for health. So if we look at this schema around what the impacts of health are, upstream, midstream, and downstream, racism affects these upstream factors. So all the policies around health, economics, welfare, housing, and taxation, structural racism influences many of these. Racism also affects the social determinants, the physical determinants, and economic and environmental determinants, including but not limited to income, education, employment, and housing. And all of these have a knock-on effect on midstream, downstream determinants. The second way that racism impacts health is through psychosocial factors, so behaviours. So a very primitive schema here, but essentially racism contributes to psychosocial factors, including stress, depression, sense of self-control, these sorts of things. And that these in turn can lead to health-related behaviours or coping strategies. Examples might include increased addiction to tobacco or increased consumption of alcohol, not brushing teeth at night, not feeling safe to go to the dentist, all these sorts of things. And there's also a pathway which is titled embodiment. So racism can contribute to chronic stress, and this actually gets under the skin. So it leads to altered DNA methylation, increased levels of cortisol, dysregulation of the immune system, which in turn can lead to many things, including differences observed in tooth structure, increased inflammatory markers in periodontal disease, and microbiome dysregulation. The third way that racism can affect health is through the undermining of health server provider-patient relationships. And I think this is dental providers is where we can probably have a huge impact. So a number of papers that I've just listed there. I think that if you're interested, this is a very good paper. The unconscious racial bias may affect dentists' clinical decisions on tooth restorability and RCT. And I'm going to discuss this paper here in more detail. So this was looking at disparities in emergency department pain treatment for toothache. And the authors concluded that persons identifying as Black were less likely than whites to receive opioids in the ED for a toothache, even with similar levels of pain. With other research showing that relative to white patients, Black patients are less likely to be given pain medications, and if pain medications are given, receive lower quantities. There's also evidence to suggest that some dental providers and health systems more broadly have both explicit or conscious racist attitudes and the unconscious or out of awareness implicit bias and racism. And these are related. So just a bit of an example here. So dental services are structured to provide non-culturally sensitive care. I'm using this example from the Australian context. This means that racial minorities may not attend for dental appointments due to not feeling welcome and feeling culturally unsafe. So their racial equities increase. And then the oral health practitioner feels that their beliefs are reinforced because racial minorities do not give importance to oral health. So in the Australian context, there have been a range of studies that have investigated experience of racism, how racism impacts on oral health through the set of interlinking biological and behavioural processes that we've discussed. But the impacts of negative life events, so these are just all the negative life events that can occur for many Indigenous Australians, has been assessed typically in non-dental settings. There's been no empirical investigation of a hypothetically protective role of less racism on negative life event related impacts on poor oral health. So there's been some epidemiological advancements, namely through effect measure modification, which enables assessment of whether the relationship of one exposure, in this case negative life events, varies within strata of another exposure, in this case racism. So the aims of my presentation today are to broadly assess the contribution of intersectionality, so social, physical and political oppressions, on oral health outcomes, and to quantify how an accumulation of these may lead to a higher magnitude of poor oral health among Indigenous Australians. I specifically aim to investigate if a lower magnitude of negative life events modifies the association between racism and poor self-rated oral health and oral health related quality of life among Indigenous Australians. The hypothesis is that the effect of racism on two measures of oral health would be smaller among those who experienced a lower magnitude of negative life events. So if we touch onto methods now, so we had a huge study that involved just over 1,000 Indigenous South Australian adults with data collected from February 2018 to January 2020. So it was a broader study that was actually investigating human papillomavirus and oral pharyngeal cancer. The study was governed by an Indigenous reference group, the data collected by Indigenous research officers, and recruitment was through Aboriginal community controlled health organisations who were our key stakeholders in the study. So after study explanation, participants signed informed consent and completed the questionnaire. And we collected information on sociodemographics, health-related factors, racism, recent history of negative life events, and self-reported oral health outcomes. We collected a lot more information than that, but for the purposes of today, I've limited it. I did want to discuss the recruitment methods because it was very specific to our target population. This photo is the broad group of investigators involved in the grant. Those with red circles around their faces are the Indigenous investigators who led the Indigenous Advisory Committee. I want to give a shout out to Ms. Joanne Hedges, who was our Senior Indigenous Research Officer for the project, who effectively recruited all 1,000 of the participants. So she led this paper, which was talking about the engagement that we had with the project using the Consider Statement. The Consider Statement is the consolidated criteria for strengthening reporting of health research involving Indigenous peoples, and it's really the framework to use when you're working in partnership with Indigenous Australians in Australia. So in our study, what we really focused on was engaging with the community providers as equal partners, having the Indigenous reference group, having the community health organisations actively engaged, promoting the study, having a very flexible agenda responsive to broader environment demands, because research certainly is not a priority for this group, and having a strong element of Indigenous capacity building. So exposure was experience of racism, and we used this using the Maya instrument. The Maya instrument was developed by Dr. Paradies and stands for the Measure of Indigenous Racism Experience. The question was, in the last 12 months, have you felt you have been treated unfairly in any of the following ways because of your identity as being an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person? There were a range of settings, which I'll talk to in the next slide. Responses recorded on a 5-point Likert scale. And we dichotomized the experience of racism as being yes, if there was one or more response options strongly of agree or strongly agree for one or more of the 9 settings. So this essentially is what it looked like for participants. The different categories of where racism might have been experienced included when applying for work or when at work, at home, by neighbours, someone else's house, at school, university training course, while doing sport, by police, security people, lawyers, doctors, dentists, nurses, other health providers, government agencies, seeking other services, member of the general public, any other situation, with participants able to tick any one of these boxes. Our effective measure modifier was the adverse life events captured using a modified form of the negative life events scale. So this was developed by Emma Cowell. The specific question was, in the last 12 months, have you or anyone in your family experienced incarceration, domestic violence, death, drug, alcohol misuse, child removal, psychological distress, cultural or spiritual pain? So it was a pretty crude measure. Response options were just yes or no. Would the participant consider to have experienced recent negative life event if he or she reported one or more in the last 12 months? And again, this is what it looked like for participants. So just a simple yes, no tick box, and all those different elements of negative life events described. The outcome measures were self-rated oral health. So this is a global measure of oral health, first conceptualized by David Locker, and asked by the question, would you rate your oral health as fair, poor, good, very good, or excellent? And those responses were dichotomized. And OHIP 14, which is an oral health related quality of life measure, which captures 7 oral health dimensions, including functional limitation, physical pain, psychological discomfort, physical disability, psychological disability, social disability, and handicap. Response options range from 0 to, which was never, to 4 very often, and summary scores were obtained. So for those not familiar with OHIP, this is what it looks like. So there's a whole battery of questions, 14 different items the participant read through, and the response options provided there. We had a few confounders. We had age dichotomized based on a median split, sex identified as male or female, geographic location. You will remember from my map earlier that a large part of South Australia is actually non-metropolitan. So we just divided it as basically Adelaide and border suburbs, and other, so metropolitan or non-metropolitan, and difficulty paying a $100 dental bill, which was our proxy measure of socio-economic position. So effect measure modification was assessed on the additive scale by means of the relative excess risks due to interaction, or the Rari. So the Rari risk corresponds to the risk that is in excess of what would be expected if the combination of, in this case, experience of racism and negative life events was entirely additive. To calculate the Rari, we use generalized linear models to generate prevalence ratios or mean rate ratios for each stratum of exposure and effect modifier. So for this, we developed a 4-category variable, which was entered into the regressions. Category A was essentially the best outcome, so no experience of racial discrimination and no negative life event. B, racial discrimination and no negative life event. C, no racial discrimination but negative life event. And D, which was the worst possible outcome, of racial discrimination and negative life event. So essentially, when you calculate the Rari, it's not too complicated. So it's basically the D, so the worst outcome, minus the B, minus the C, plus the A, which was the most positive. And this is both for the prevalence ratios and the mean risk ratios. So it's important to consider that when you interpret Rari, it's not really the size that matters, it's the direction. Is it positive or negative? With a positive value meaning that the combination of, in our case, experience of racism and negative life events is higher than the sum of their independent effects on oral health outcomes. So it's a super additive association. So here are some of our findings. I just want to point out that of our over 1,011 participants, these represented 5% of the eligible Indigenous South Australian population during the recruitment period, 8.2% of those in the non-metropolitan area and 3% of those in metropolitan. And I've just showcased some of the estimates against national population benchmarks, so you can get a bit of a sense as to how representative or not representative our sample is. So we had just over a third were male. This is compared to 50% at a national level. Just under half were aged 37 years and younger. So this is a higher prevalence than national estimates. Almost 2/3 lived in non-metropolitan locations. This is much higher than national estimates. Over 3/4 experienced difficulty paying a $100 dental bill compared to a quarter at a national level. Over half have experienced racism in the last 12 months compared to just over 10% at a national level. Over 86% had experienced one or more negative life events in the last 12 months. And unfortunately, we have no national level estimates for that one. Just over a third had fair or poor self-rated oral health compared to less than a quarter nationally. And mean OHIP score was 17 compared to 5 nationally. So if we just look at our categories of A through to D, we had 9% that had experienced no racism and no negative life event, 6 who experienced racism but no negative life event, 39% who experienced no racism but a negative life event. And this is the terrifying finding. I think we had just under half who had experienced racism and a negative life event in the last 12 months. So if we look at some of the bivariate analyses, and I'm really just going to focus on the category D here. So compared to the total prevalence of 46%, slightly less were aged 37 years and under, more were male, less lived in non-metropolitan locations, slightly more had difficulty paying a $100 dental bill, 54% had fair or poor self-rated oral health, and the mean OHIP was 19 compared to 17. So, and this is where I need to look at my notes. This analysis shows the effect measure modification of negative life events on the association between experience of racism and fair, poor self-rated oral health. In comparison with the reference category, so this is this group here, who had no experience of racism and no negative life events, and after adjusting for confounding, those with experience of racism and negative life events have 1.69 times the prevalence of fair, poor, self-rated oral health. Participants with experience of racism but no negative life events have 1.17 times the prevalence of fair, poor, 1.4 times the prevalence, and participants with no racism but negative life events have 1.17 times the prevalence of fair, poor, self-rated oral health. So the Rari is 0.23. This is positive. So that means there's a super additive association between racism, negative life event, which is the effect modifier, and poor self-rated oral health. If we look to our next outcome, which was oral health related quality of life, or mean OHIP, we can see that the findings are similar. So in comparison with the reference category of participants with no racism, no negative life events, and after adjusting for confounding, those with experience of racism and negative life events have 1.41 times the mean OHIP. Those with experience of racism but no negative life event have 1.26 times the mean OHIP, and participants with no racism but negative life events have 1.04 times the mean OHIP. So the Rari is 0.08, which is not as great as the last finding, but we're working with means, so we don't often find much of it. The difference is often smaller with means, but it's still positive, meaning a super additive association between racism, negative life event, and mean OHIP. You know, the older I get, the more I come to really appreciate the value of qualitative findings, especially in our work with Indigenous Australians. So I've put up some of the feedback that we had. We had some focus groups that we collected as part of the study as well. And these were the ones that really struck me. So Cheryl is a middle-aged Indigenous woman. I can't see my slide because there's Zoom things happening at the top. And she said she went to see a dentist in the city, and it's like they don't treat you like you're human. They talk down to you. Recently, when Cheryl went to a new dentist, the dentist explained verbally and through illustrations everything clearly. Cheryl was surprised and said, "You're the first dentist that I've ever been to in my life that's actually treated me as a human being." An Indigenous female elder said, "When you're really in pain, you can't get the care. You've got to wait. You wait until Christmas next year. You might as well give up, you know. That's what most people do." A young Indigenous male said, "It's not fun, you know. You go there, lay on the bed there, and they're right on you. It can't be helped, but it's not a very good feeling to go in there and lay with people you don't know. So anybody will get a bit uptight about it." Earlier experiences caused Cheryl to deduce that people who are working for low income earners and Aboriginal organisations, they're not there with passion or heart. So if we go to some of our discussion points, our basic findings was that in a large sample of Indigenous Australians, over half had experienced racism and almost all had experienced one or more negative life events in the past 12 months. The prevalence and severity of poor self-rated oral health and oral health related quality of life were of magnitude far greater than national level estimates. What we found from our effect measure modification analysis was that the more oppressions participants experienced, in our case, the form of racism and negative life events, the greater the burden of oral health outcomes. So racism was the exposure, which means that it's the intervention point. If patients had experienced less racism, the impact of negative life events on self-reported oral health outcomes would have been less. In Australia, in the last decade, there has been a huge groundswell movement around public health awareness towards the impacts of racism on health and well-being, especially mental health. So we've had probably the leaders have been through sport. The top photo here is of a AFL player. AFL is Australian Football League. It's a very unusual game played in Australia around bouncing the ball and kicking and running and things. So Nicky Widmer was a fabulous AFL player. He was Aboriginal and he was constantly taunted. And this is a famous photo where he just lifts his shirt and points to his skin and says, "This is who I am." So following from the sport leadership around racism, we've had also movements in education, health, politics, society more broadly. And I think in the last year or so, we've been very much influenced by the United States and the Black Lives Matter movement as well. But I think that we need to also pay attention to the negative life events that many Indigenous Australians experience in an overwhelming number, frequency, and magnitude. This requires enormous commitment to reduce historical and contemporary structural inequities that continue to rent the fabric of Indigenous society and culture. So this backdrop is of our new flash dental school in Adelaide, which I'm hoping that you'll all come over and visit. But I want to talk a bit more about, now that we can see that the mechanisms through which racism affects oral health are interconnected, then I would argue that the strategies to mitigate racism must be too. So these are some of the structural factors that need to change, in my opinion. I think that we need to reconsider how we recruit and select dental students with low proportions of racially marginalised groups in dental schools around the globe. And there's some very important work done by Rizwana Lala from Sheffield University in the UK around this. I think that certainly in Australia, we need to embed a lot more cultural competency in the training packages of all our oral health personnel. I think we need to consider many other incentives, financial and otherwise, for oral health personnel to work in communities in which racially underpowered groups reside. These are typically socially disadvantaged groups living in remote locations, in the case in Australia. I think dental services more broadly need to be restructured to provide culturally safe care. I think all policies need to recognise historical cumulative impacts of racism on socioeconomic factors. So the sort of, if you think back to that upstream figure that I showed earlier in the presentation. I think we need to consider the impact of transnational corporations, the huge food groups there. So there's many oral health damaging foods, beverages and products that are specifically targeted to socially vulnerable groups through very effective marketing campaigns. And I think essentially there's not enough seats at the table for racially marginalised groups for decision-making leadership in oral healthcare systems and academic institutions and health policy more broadly. That is certainly the case in Australia. I can't speak to the US. So if we look at some of our strengths and limitation, I think the main strength is the engagement that we've had largely through the leadership of Ms. Joanne Hedges with South Australia's Indigenous communities. We've had excellent recruitment. I had people ringing me on the phone asking me what they could do to be part of the study. I mean, that's never happened before. And there's a commitment to remain engaged long term. In fact, we've just received funding to continue the study for another 5 years. So that's a huge relief for us. I think it's important to consider that the study was undertaken over extremely vast distances. So Adelaide is based here. These are all the different Aboriginal community groups that we went to visit. I mean, obviously, South Australia, there's a lot of desert out there too. But essentially, we travelled 450 miles to the west, 250 miles to the east, 500 miles to the north. We were involving participants who were highly disadvantaged, who have not always enjoyed positive research interactions. And we did all this in the midst of a global pandemic. I think the limitations are that we only looked at racism and negative life events. I had said at the start that I was interested in a vast array of oppressions, social, physical, political, and historical, but we didn't, we only chose two. The non-Indigenous Australian comparator group was missing, so all of our analysis was done within a group that was already socially marginalised. The outcomes were self-report. Moving forward, we will be collecting clinical data, so it will be interesting to see if our findings are even more emphasised there. And the study wasn't representative. We didn't aim to go out to find a representative study, but the true impact of our findings today actually may be far greater than what we've found so far. So some concluding comments and moving forward. The study was one of the first of its kind to use intersectionality as a theory to explain some of the Indigenous oral health inequities, which simultaneously considered the additive impacts of racism and negative life events on oral health. I would argue that intersectionality can't be ignored in any research involving and in partnership with vulnerable groups. And I think that it's crucial, if we think back to that power, the wheel of power and privilege, to consider the context from those with lived experience of intersectionality. So in the US, there's been some fabulous books out. So the authors of The Broken Ladder, wonderful book, very good book. How Inequality Affects the Way We Think, Live and Die. Bias by Jennifer Eberhardt and The Hillbilly Allergy are great examples of this. But if reading's not your thing, then I would encourage you to consider looking at the YouTube clip from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie around the danger of a single story, who basically encapsulates the essence of my presentation in an 11-minute clip, very entertaining, drawing on her own experiences as an author from Nigeria, but living in the United States. She's got very, very clear, cutting, insightful comments to make. So drawing to an end, there are many people who I need to acknowledge. I need to acknowledge our funder, the National Health Medical Research Council, for their grant for the study. A huge debt of gratitude to our study participants, our Indigenous reference group, study staff, participating Aboriginal community controlled health organisations. You can see all their different logos down the bottom there and up to the side. Big thank you to the fabulous Jo, who has single-handedly led this project for over 5 years now. John Quinn Yu, who's done all the statistical analysis, and other ARCO staff who have provided many useful contributions to today's presentation. This was a photo that was just taken last week. We had a lunch at one of the university lawns. And I just wanted to share, this is a photo of one of our PhD students who, when we were allowed to travel, presented some of the findings at an international conference on, I think it was Indigenous cancer in Calgary in Canada. So we've got a couple of the CEOs from the Aboriginal community organisations who travelled with Jo and the PhD student. It's the first time they've left Australia. We needed to organise passports, but it was hugely beneficial for us to have the study showcased by Aboriginal leaders for a project that had been organised largely through them. And my final slide, talking about Hokey Pokey ice cream. So just to bring back my friend Tanya, so we've kept in touch over the years. She was very happy for me to share her story. She is still living in our hometown. She has she's really connected with her Maori identity. This is a meeting house where Maori people go to meet and to congregate. So Tanya is working in a tourism shop in our hometown. In New Zealand, the main ice cream that we sort of promote to tourists is Hokey Pokey ice cream. So it's essentially vanilla ice cream filled with little chunky bits of honeycomb. So really, it's a super sweet ice cream. I don't personally like it myself. It's way too sweet. But Tanya wanted me to invite you to come and visit her to have some Hokey Pokey ice cream so that she can share her story more broadly. And I would love anyone to come and visit us in Adelaide, because we haven't had visitors for such a long time, and we're desperate to hear news from people from outside of Australia. So thank you so much for your attention, and thank you again for the invitation to present. I will stop sharing.
Thank you so much for an incredibly powerful presentation. Before we get to the broader question and answer session, I know that Dr. Giddon would like to make a few remarks. Dr. Giddon?
Yes, I'm right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. This is a brilliant exposition of where we are with respect to the effects of racism and poverty on health. I can only say that we started at Harvard years ago with the concept of ecological dentistry to include all the non-technical aspects of dentistry, from the interaction with the patients to the role of society. And now we have come full circle, and I'm so appreciative of Dr. Jamieson bringing this full circle and back again. It's unbelievable that we now recognize that even thoughts connect with the immune system and can have an effect on our health. I'd like to hear from some of the other speakers, the audience on some of these matters, but this was a privilege for me, an honor, and so forth. I can say no more than thank you so much, Professor Jamieson.
Thank you, Dr. Giddon.
So we can start with a question from Rania Kelly. In terms of the intersectionality wheel you presented, she's always found the words power and marginalized suppressive language. As a person who identifies with multiple minority identities, it has always made her feel less than. When she presents intersectionality wheels in workshops, she removes the word power and replaces marginalized with system barriers, feeling this better reflects the reality in a way that is respectful to minority groups. What might your thoughts be on that?
Jane, I'm so sorry, I can barely hear the question. Are you able to just ask me the essence of that again? Sorry.
Sure. In terms of intersectionality, in terms of the intersectionality wheel that was presented, Dr. Kelly has always found the word power and marginalized as suppressive. As a person who identifies with multiple minority identities, it has always made her feel less than. When presenting intersectionality wheels in workshops, she removes the word power and replaces marginalized with system barriers, feeling that this better reflects the reality in a way that is respectful to minority groups, and wondering what your thoughts are on these replacements.
Oh, yes, I completely agree. I hands down agree. I mean, I honestly feel that I am an imposter when I talk about intersectionality, because I have benefited from the privileges of being who I am all my life. And so I don't feel like I'm the expert. I think that the expert are the people who are on those outer margins of that wheel of power privilege. So I absolutely support those suggestions and look forward to having more seats at the table in that sense.
Thank you. Do we have any questions here in our live audience? Dr. Donoff.
Well, great talk, really important. The real question is, how do you get that in a curriculum of a dental school? But as a New Zealander where dental nurses originated, what kind of systems exist in Australia? I haven't been there in a long time, but there's just one national dental service. There aren't state services, am I right?
Well, first of all, I'll encourage you to come and visit us again. Yes, so I was trained and raised and trained in New Zealand, and we do just have the one system there, and dental nurses do provide the care for the children. In Australia, it's a hybrid model. So we have the public dental system, which provides care to those on a healthcare card. So that this is a means tested system. So you have to have some level of social disadvantage, if you like. And the rest of dental services are provided out of pocket through the private sector. But there's enormous inequities. There's a large group who are almost the working poor, so don't have enough to really be able to afford regular dental care through the private sector, but earn too much to be eligible for a healthcare card. There's been a recent fabulous decision from Canada to have dental included in the general health. In Australia, it's called the Medicare system. So in Australia, you can have free health provided through the government, but not dental. But in Canada, it's now dental as well as general health. So we're hoping that we can use that as an exemplar for how we can move forward. But it's a broken system in Australia, absolutely.
So we've heard presentations from some of your colleagues in Australia who talk about a tiered approach to oral health care delivery, beginning with community health workers, dental hygienists, therapists, general dentists, and specialists. Do you think that that model is more successful in reaching people where they are and potentially offering more opportunities to bring people from different communities into the healthcare pipeline as providers?
That's a great question. Hard to know. I think that there's benefits of a hybrid model for sure. I know from my experience in Australia, many of our patients just don't want to go to the dentist if it's in the city. So I think taking services out to remote locations is the only way that they will receive the care. The problem with Australia is that we can't seem to get the dentists to go to the areas where they're most needed. So I think that we can probably take lessons from the New Zealand model in terms of training what we call oral health therapists to treat children and adults who can do a large bulk of the work and are a lot cheaper, often have a different philosophical outlook. And I think in terms of Aboriginal community organisations per se, there's a lot more empowerment from ACCHOs, Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organisations, to fund healthcare services themselves, but they can't afford dental because it's so expensive. And so I think that a hybrid model in that way may be the best. I mean, we have situations of children needing to be treated under a general anaesthetic in hospital, and we can't do that in the remote communities. And so the kids tend to, if they make it to the city, they tend to not realise all the different protocols in terms of not eating before, not having breakfast before you come in for theatre and that sort of thing. So that system tends to fail, and so the kids have a negative experience of dental services right from a young age, and just don't want to go ever. And unfortunately, that's generational.
Yeah, the distances that you were describing are pretty impressive in terms of thinking about how to disseminate care over such vast territory. It's pretty challenging.
Oh yeah, that's hugely challenging. It's fun though.
So we have another question from our audience. Satya Koto asks, as a person from a Commonwealth country, wondering how colonization impacted traditional alternative medicine and dietary practices that were practiced in Indigenous communities in Australia, and does loss of this knowledge correlate at all with overall decline in oral and overall health in those communities?
Yeah, great question. So we've got evidence to show that up until the 1970s, Indigenous Australians had far better oral health than non-Indigenous Australians because there was less access to refined foods. So traditional ways of oral hygiene were many. There was traditions of using twigs from, there's a certain tree that you can sort of pick a twig off and strip the bark away, and you can use it to clean in between your gums. Charcoal was used against the gums as well. So I think that it's soul destroying when you realise just how the disease rates of Indigenous Australians have just increased in the last sort of 50 years or so. In terms of oral practices, it's quite difficult as a dentist sometimes, because I remember when I first moved to Australia and I was working in Central Australia, so working in the heart of Alice Springs, which is right in the middle of the country. And the Aboriginal language groups there have a very strong culture whereby a male going through initiation has his front tooth knocked out. And it's generally, it's a passage, it's a right passage. And so he would have that tooth knocked out with a spear usually. And often it would be extraordinarily painful, that was the whole point. But then the person would have no front tooth. And so the culture would recognize that he'd gone through initiation. But I would have males come to me and asking me to remove their front incisor. And I was so conflicted because I knew that I couldn't morally do it because the tooth wasn't, there was no disease. So how could I as a dentist remove a non-diseased tooth? But then often the next day the patient would come back and the tooth would have been broken off with, one guy came to me and he had a chisel, the initiation had involved a chisel, trying to chisel the tooth off. And so he had a root stump, it was massively infected, he was all swollen, he was very septic. And I just thought, oh, Lisa, you should have just taken that tooth out. So I think it's, I'm so mired in Western scientific practices that I couldn't remove myself and put myself in his shoes, if you like, and actually provide the care that he came for.
Story. Another question from Suzanne Bergman. We can certainly send your contact info. And Dr. Lois Cohen asks, are there plans to test intervention strategies for these communities? And I'll just sort of piggyback onto that. As academicians, what do you think we can take from this research, and what might we begin to implement some of it and change our own behaviors?
I'm so sorry, Jane. I don't know if something's wrong with my system, but I can barely hear the question. What was the first part? I think it's better when the microphone's closer. What was the first part of that question?
The first part is, are there plans to test intervention strategies in these communities?
Are there plans to have intervention strategies in the communities?
Plans to test the intervention strategies in the Indigenous communities.
Yeah, so when we're working in a partnership with Indigenous communities, it needs to be Indigenous-led. So any interventions, often with oral health, it links in with other chronic diseases. So we've got a very good initiative happening at the moment around end-stage kidney disease, because end-stage kidney disease is a huge problem in Indigenous communities. It's like something times 100 times the prevalence in non-Indigenous populations. But before patients can be waitlisted for kidney transplantation, they need to have a full dental workup. So we have been involved in going to communities, providing that comprehensive dental care in a culturally safe way, not removing all the teeth, because that's been the practice in the past, but really trying to save as many teeth as we can. And that way we are getting, I think we've got 5 participants in the last week who have now been waitlisted for a kidney transplant because their oral health is now, it was the last tick that they needed. So I think that's given us a lot of traction in the community more generally around just improving oral health for the sake of improving chronic disease conditions. We know that we can also improve HbA1c levels. We know that we can improve biomarkers of cardiovascular disease as well. So I think that most of our interventions in the Indigenous space in Australia are around chronic disease management. And sorry, the second part of that question?
Just wondering how, as academicians, we could put your research into action.
Yeah. Yeah, it is tricky. You know, I think day to day, I think we can all consider our own privilege and our own, where we sit in that wheel of power. I think the fact that we all are in some way engaged in a dental school means that we've benefited from our privilege in some way. There's very good implicit bias tests that I think can be done. I think Harvard developed them actually. And I think that if we can place ourselves in terms of where our own positionality is, even just patient interactions will improve. Clinically, it's a bit more tricky because we've got certain mandates that we have to fulfill, and we treat disease because we are trained in a biomedical model. But I think it's more those social interactions that can make a difference too. But I think it's also having a social conscience, you know, speaking out against racism if we see it, actively encouraging cultural competency training courses within a curricula, engaging with students who may come from different backgrounds and patient groups as well.
Thank you. Dean Ginobili.
So Dr. Jamieson, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
So thank you for the beautiful presentation. And I think the study that you were highlighting really has the makings of a landmark study, and it's wonderful that you're going to be able to continue it. You mentioned Michael Marmot and the social determinants of health and looking at social gradients. And so I remember at an IADR meeting about 10 years ago, it was in Barcelona, they assembled a whole group on this topic that eventually the IADR developed the GOHIRA Global Oral Health Inequalities Research Network. And as Michael Marmot was saying, not so much attention had been specifically placed on oral health. And so over this past decade, and you've watched the field, and you gave in your discussion some of the next steps for all of us. What do you think have been the biggest accomplishments, in terms of the trajectory of having an impact? And then where do you think we can go? We already heard about the education piece.
Yes, thank you. Well, yes, I was at that Barcelona meeting as well. It was so exciting to have that Coherent network be established. And I've been involved with that group quite a lot in the past few years. I think that Coherent, it's a great group. It really takes the premise of the social determinants of health, but I don't know if you had the opportunity to meet the wonderful Aubrey Shyham, but he had so many criticisms of the social determinants of health, mainly around the wheel of power and how the people developing the social determinants of health theory really had no lived experience of the very things that they were espousing. Coherent as a group now is represented largely by those who would be on the outer rim, if you like, of that wheel of power, and it's just so encouraging to have the leadership as it should be. So people like myself have actually stepped back from it. If we're asked to help, we will certainly help. So I think that has been an enormous step forward, just from IADR's perspective. In terms of dental curricula, I think that Harvard probably is an exemplar of teaching dentistry the way that it should be on the many levels. I think that Professor Giddon has made monumental contributions in that way, just considering so many other aspects that contribute to oral health and disease outside of our own little narrow sphere. I guess it's making sure that intersectionality is front and foremost of the theoretical frameworks which are presented in any dental public health forums. I know that students often don't like dental public health because it's kind of boring and they feel that they can't do anything about it. But I think that there's so many stories out there, and the stories are where the heart and the passion can be sometimes for students. That's been my experience, at least. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think that may conclude our question and answer session for today. Dr. Giddon, any concluding remarks?
Yes. I think the whole idea of bringing behavioral health, mental health with oral health has been way lost over the years, and hoping that the group of us, behavioral scientists in the beginning, went many years before people really recognized what Dr. Jamieson is now presenting so well. It's just so reassuring that we're now on the path to include things that we talked about, like psychophysiology of the oral cavity, are now coming to fruition and recognition clinically. And I thank Dr. Jamieson for a wonderful presentation and the privilege that I have of being here.
Thank you.
We'll see you in Boston sometime soon, and it seems like we all have a date for ice cream down south.
Thank you. I just want to remind everybody, I think that we had a very successful morning session of posters, and mostly research posters by our DNP student, and we'll have afternoon sessions. We'll continue our afternoon sessions of research posters, and again, this will be given by our HE student, most of it. A lot of excitement to look forward.